I think it's time to right a wrong from my past. Back in the summer of 2003, I fired up Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire for the first time. Having loved the first two generations so dearly, Pokemania had faded away significantly. Beyblade was the happening thing at the time, but a new Pokemon game rolling around wasn't something I was about to sleep on. So I gleefully fired up my Game Boy Advance and threw myself into the sparkly new third generation games. And I didn't like them. I really didn't like them. And because of that, I ended up abandoning Pokemon games for a long time. But on reflection, I feel like I was maybe too harsh on these games. So I wanted to have a fresh playthrough for the first time since 2003 to see how I perceive the experience all these years later. Just for disclosure, I have played Emerald now. I nuzlocked it on Twitch last year actually. Lost in the final battle though. Sadness. And I've played the remakes once as well. So I've definitely started making my peace with the Hoenn region. But to get that full closure, I think I need to give the originals another play. So let's do that. I'm bringing you guys along for the ride. I definitely remember liking the starting locations. That's something. Little Root reminded me a lot of Pallet Town. It gave off very similar vibes. And even all the way to Petalburg Woods and the first gym being a rock-type gym, it felt like there was some intentional familiarity being injected into the early game. But the region definitely felt brighter than the first two. It felt like I was in a more tropical place. If Kanto was the suburbs you grew up in, and Johto was the quiet countryside where you visited your grandparents, then Hoenn was the summer vacation spot. So back at release, I was semi-happily ambling my way through the game early on. I remember it was when I came back to my save when I was sitting in bed one evening that my first issue arose with Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. I loaded up the game to see that it was still daytime. And I was confused because I was like, I remember setting the time at the very beginning. Shouldn't it be dark at this time? And I came to the realization that these games dropped the day-night cycle that was introduced in the previous generation. Now that might not have been a deal breaker for a lot of people, but the day-night cycle was probably my favourite thing about Silver, Gold and Crystal. It was an extra layer of immersion that really kept me in the experience. Because when I was closing the game, it didn't feel like I was just putting it on pause. It felt like the world was still active even when I was away from it. Ruby and Sapphire still had day cycles for growing berries, for example, but just didn't get aesthetically dark, and that made me sad. It didn't bother me as much this time around, but it's something I still felt. There's no way I could have complained about the early game Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire though, because these are some of the best. Zigzagoon, Poochyena, the split Wurmple line. I feel like most of my favourite Hoenn Pokemon can be encountered on the first three routes. So it'll come as no surprise that the Zigzagoon and Poochyena I caught at the beginning of this playthrough carried us through to the very end. I actually decided to do something I do on occasion with Pokemon games as well, and box my starter at the beginning of the game. So Zigzagoon was technically my starter during this playthrough. It isn't too far into the game when we meet my absolute favourite character in the entirety of the Hoenn region, Mr. Briny, and his beloved Wingull, Pico. He's a gem, literally ferries us around for free whenever we want, forever running circles playing with Pico. Protect this man at all costs. If you're one of those people who never came back after he dropped you off in Slateport to deliver the Devon goods, I hope you're ashamed of yourself. He's still there, waiting. Speaking of Slateport, is it just me that thinks the soundtrack for this city sounds kinda Christmassy? Could just be me, but it sounds like a jingle straight out of a Home Alone movie or something. I do remember being kind of overwhelmed by the sheer amount of things added between Gens 2 and 3. Pokemon abilities, natures, weather effects, overworld weather effects. They were all things that, without any proper guides, I struggled to understand a little bit. I think if I'd had a physical guidebook with all the abilities and natures and things all listed, I'd have gotten used to them fairly quickly, because I loved guidebooks and stuff as a kid. Anything that was sort of supporting literature for a game I was playing, I was all over it. I'd sit on my bed and read those things all day. Of course, coming back to these games all these years later when I've had the chance to play many of the more recent titles, and having the luxury of being able to immediately Google anything I don't understand, it was a complete non-issue this time around. Double battles, I remember, sent me into a spin too. I think my problem with double battles at the time was that they went against my basic perceptions of Pokemon. I'd always known Pokemon as a 1v1 kind of deal. It didn't make sense in my head that you could basically have two battles going on at once. It just felt a bit chaotic. So that could have been a bit of a Gem 1 style problem on my end. Funnily enough, I'm still not a huge fan of double battles to this day. Maybe it's partly a reason why I've never ventured into the VGC side of Pokemon, but I don't mind them. The Indigo Disc in Scarlet and Violet actually made me warm up to them a lot. So the main story of Ruby and Sapphire centers around the evil teams in these games. Depending on the version, the more active one you're fighting against is either Team Magma or Team Aqua. And even as a young kid, I still felt smarter than these idiots. They came across as a bit klutzy to me. Team Magma wants to expand the world's landmass, Team Aqua wants to expand the world's water. Both teams think this is a healthy idea for the planet for some reason, and they want to harness the power of the game's respective dormant legendary Pokemon to achieve those goals. In the end though, when the legendary is awakened, it becomes apparent that this is a very bad idea. Shocking. And we have to defeat or catch the legendary to put a stop to it. And while I like the idea of having two highly contrasting evil teams locking horns with each other, the whole narrative here is kinda thin. It's a cool idea on paper, but their motivations aren't developed or pushed back on enough in my view. They want to do what they're trying to do because they think it will make the world better, but no one tries to press them on why it's a bad idea. I feel like there should have been a bit more back and forth, more arguing for both sides to develop the conflict as the story climbs towards its climax. Not the worst evil teams by any means though. I think we've had much worse since. I just think there were some missed opportunities. That actually segues nicely to a more widely held criticism of these games, which is the egregious amount of water in Hoenn. It's a tired joke at this point. You'll most likely just garner a couple of chuckles if you mention it nowadays, but it was an issue for some people, and there is a reason for that. The region is kind of cut in half by land routes and water routes. It mirrors the theme of the evil team's story here. Land versus sea. It's clever in that sense. So what was the issue here? Water routes in Pokemon games, older Pokemon games in particular, were very similar in experience to caves, in that you're often surrounded by nothingness. So if you think of it like that, imagine if pretty much half of a Pokemon's game map was just caves. And it's very easy to get yourself lost when you're surrounded at all sides by water. You can't tell how close or far you are from anything. Add to that the constant wild encounters. In caves we're bombarded with Zubat and Geodude. On water we're bombarded with Tentacool and Tentacruel. Repels are your best friend in these areas of the game. Have I mentioned to you guys before that I never used to use repels as a kid? I knew they existed, I knew what they did, I just never really used them. And thinking about it now, it might have come down to a money thing. Because in older games, items didn't constantly respawn like they do in Scarlet and Violet for example. There wasn't an endless supply of items you could accumulate and sell to farm hundreds of thousands of Pokédollars. You had a set number of items scattered throughout the game and that was it. So you were kinda limited to how much money you could acquire in older games like these. So was I going to spend the limited money I had to avoid a few Pokemon encounters? Apparently not worth it, 9-year-old me decided. And to be honest, even with repels on, the unholy amount of trainers you run into on these water routes will certainly do the job of numbing what's left of your brain. That's why large water routes are kind of annoying in a nutshell. Add to that the addition of diving in Ruby and Sapphire, where you can dive underwater in places where the water is a darker colour and explore the seabed. I never knew where the hell I was when I resurfaced. It disoriented me even more. So there's something to it. It's not just people complaining for the sake of complaining. I personally think if you toned down the amount of trainers swimming around and dropped the encounter rate by 20%, Hoenn's water routes would be a lot more bearable. So speaking of diving, Dive was a new HM introduced in these games. And there are too many HMs in these games. That whole problem started here. As always, you can put yourself through some light torture to scuff by without flash, but all the others are needed in a lot of places to get you by. Apart from Cut. Cut wasn't mandatory in these games, I noticed. It's only required to grant you access to optional areas. You never need it to actually progress through the game. That was interesting to notice during this fresh playthrough. I did need to swap a level 10 Tentacool into my team on a couple of occasions though, purely to appease the requirements for Dive and Waterfall. Victory Road in particular was a hellscape for HM use. I find myself discovering new heights of gratitude for the expulsion of HMs with each passing day. The map itself is pretty diverse though. There's desert, volcanoes, forest, beaches. It definitely was a step up in that area. And that again might have just been a lot at once for me as a kid. God, it sounds like I was the most simple-minded child, doesn't it? Oh no, too much new, my little brain can't take it. It was probably less that and more that it was such a stark contrast to what came before it. In a lot of ways, it broke my personal perceptions of what Pokémon was. It was almost like a new era of Pokémon was being ushered in at this point. In terms of rivals in these games, they're probably the least present of any rivals in the series. I remember not liking May for how friendly she was. But one thing I totally forgot was that after the battle in Lilycove City, she just dips. Just decides that she's done with battling and wants to sail off into the sunset to work on the Pokédex. Only around 6 badges in as well. So I was like, okay, cool, thanks for the memories I guess. I swear I've been Mandela affected with one of these battles as well. Because I could have sworn May collars you on the bridge next to the Weather Institute. But it's just after the bridge apparently. Only a small difference, but that's messed with my head a little bit. We do sort of have a secondary rival in these games too. Probably shouldn't call him a rival though, to be fair. Wally, who's this really timid little boy who we don't actually see too much throughout the games. We chaperone him while he catches his first Pokemon, and we only battle him twice throughout the entire game. The first when he's incredibly weak and new to Pokemon, and the second right at the end of Victory Road where he's developed significantly as a trainer. If you'd have asked me a couple of years ago if I liked Wally, I'd have said I hate this annoying little kid's guts. But I'm kinda just indifferent to him these days. He's not very consequential in the big picture, but he fills in the story a little more. It'd be fun to see Wally come back in a future game all grown up. I think he did make a small appearance in Gen 7 in the post-game, so hopefully there is more of him to come at some point. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive retrospective or anything. I just wanted to play the games again and see how my sentiment towards them differed from when I first played them all those years ago. And I 100% enjoyed them a lot more this time around. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the amount of new stuff introduced in these games overwhelmed me a bit as a young kid, along with the removal of a couple of things that made me love Generation 2 as much as I did. I'm definitely a Hoenn fan now though. I think it's a very pretty region. A lot of my favourite Pokemon these days are from Hoenn. And yeah, I've finally now completed the original games. My original save file is still there actually, on my original Ruby cartridge. And I'm standing just outside the Pokemon League. That's as far as I got back in the day. And this team definitely was not prepared to take on the Elite Four. It's kinda crazy to be able to look back at a file that's 21 years old. It's probably older than some of you guys watching this video right now. My god, I wish I hadn't said that. Time is terrifying. What do you guys think of these games? I know a lot of people entered the Pokemon franchise with these games, so they are entries that mean a lot to a lot of people. And yeah, I didn't vibe with them at all when they first released, but it's safe to say I do now. This definitely won't be my last playthrough of these games. I think the story elements were quite simple, but that could very much have been fully intentional, considering all the new features and mechanics that were introduced in these games. Let me know what you think of my Hall of Fame team too. This team was a lot of fun to play with for me. Thank you so much for watching, drop a like if you can, that little button click helps a hell of a lot. Subscribe for more Pokemon videos, and I'll catch you all in the next one.